Today we need to make sure that we're covering Chapter 11 and Chapter 12. Chapter 11 is going to be covered with this sheet. We've got to make shortcuts, and this is one of them. Okay? So this is basically the stuff you need to know from Chapter 11. All right? So I'm just going to go through some of this stuff. If you have any questions on it, by all means, ask. But this is it. The cotton gin spurred production of cotton on a massive scale and led to a symbiotic relationship with textile manufacturing. You need to know that relationship between the cotton gin and the emergence of textiles in the early 19th century. You need to know that the Southern economy was dominated by agriculture, which we've known for a while, but now it's going to be dominated by cotton. Okay? The cotton being grown in the deep south is the cash crop that most of the southern states rely upon. How much so? Southern cotton production at its peak represented 50% of all U.S. exports. Think about that. Half of everything that the United States exports is cotton. So it is the economic foundation of this country. Cotton is the economy of the United States prior to the Civil War, which is why southern states were so convinced that nobody would do anything to harm that institution, like free slaves, because the cotton was based on slave labor. 75% of the world's cotton came from the American South. It's why Southern politicians like James Hammond of South Carolina referred to the institution as King Cotton. I mean, who would be stupid enough to interfere with American cotton production? At least that was the thought process. Southern social class was dominated by the planter aristocracy, the planter elites. They had the wealth, the time to run for elected office, dominate governance, affect the economy, and be the dominant presence in the social structure of the South. My friends, the planter aristocrats in the South dominated the politics. They were your senators, they were your governors, they were your representatives, because they had the time to do it. They had slaves doing the labor. Therefore, they had all the free time in the world to sit around and think about things like liberty and freedom, because the slaves were doing all the work. Planters saw themselves psychologically as the defenders of the realm, which is why they embraced this idea of chivalry. They saw themselves almost like the feudal system, like the lords of the manor, the defenders of the realm. They were the ones who were going to defend the South against all comers, including the North, which is why they embraced this idea of chivalry and a code of honor, militarism. A lot of these planter elites sent their sons to military school to learn a military education. It's why the South had better generals during the Civil War, because it was a culture of militarism and training. The planter aristocracy dominated the economy. When you constitute 50% of America's exports, you're going to have a say. And they dominated the society because it's what everybody aspired to. That was the goal. The carrot and the stick, that was the goal. I, too, someday could be a planter elite if I work hard and play by the rules. Planter elites, for all their influence, represented 1/10 of 1% of the Southern population. In 1860, there were only 1,733 families who owned 100 or more slaves. So think about it. When you think of the South, you think of PowerPoint presentations having to take 3 minutes to pull up because the hamster on the treadmill inside the computer that runs it is a little slow. God, let's go. That's what you think of. When you think of the South, when you think of cotton production in the antebellum South, you think of what I call the Gone with the Wind South. That's the Gone with the Wind South. The house with the big pillars, the magnolia trees, the big shaded lanes, the master of the house sitting on the front porch saying, "Oh my, it is hot today. I do believe I have the vapors. I'm going to need another iced tea." That's what you think of. But that only constituted 1,733 families. That's not a lot of people in a region of 9 million people. 1,733 families live this lifestyle. That's it. Yet, this is what you think about. Because that's what dominated the South. The politics, the society, and the economy. Most slave owners did not live this kind of life. Most slave owners lived that kind of life. Simple farm, owned a couple of slaves, usually 2 to 5. If you were a slave owner in the South, on average, you owned 2 to 5 slaves. Which meant what? Yeah. You had an extraordinarily close relationship with them. Absolutely. You worked side by side with your slaves. They were supplemental labor for you. So you had a familiar relationship. Unlike the planter elite who lives on the plantation, where you may not know who the slaves are out in the field except as a name in a book, because you're keeping records. You're intimately familiar with your slaves. Now here's the killer. 75% of Southerners owned no slaves. Zero. Nada. None. That is a major point to understand. Because it was these non-slave owning whites who were the first ones to take up arms when the Civil War started. Why? Yeah. The carrot and stick idea that maybe someday I too could profit off of the slave system, so why would I want to get rid of it? That is definitely a possibility. Why else might poor white farmers not want to get rid of slavery?
They had less to lose.
What do you mean?
They don't have as much influence as the planter elites.
Right, so why would they want to step in and defend the institution that benefits the planter elites? If they don't have a stake in it, why are they the first ones to take up arms? Alita.
Well, I would say probably because the government had been indoctrinating them, like, oh, we don't have slavery, this whole way of life, the whole idea is going to topple over us. And they were just like, oh, we don't have slaves, but we don't want to wreck the whole.
I would agree with you that the governing culture in the South indoctrinated the people of the South to buy in to the slave system as essential for the success of the region. I'll give you that. What do you mean?
I don't know. They had the average farmer had a lot more say in government than in like the north because of
Okay. All right. Well, I mean, they were listened to. So, I mean, if that counts as influence. But what happens if you get rid of slaves? What do they become? The yeoman farmers possibly become the workforce, and the yeoman farmer is no better than the freed slave. This slavery delineates race. And if slaves are free, what's to stop slaves from being considered the equivalent of the poor white person? For a poor white person in the South, as long as there is slavery, they're not the bottom of the food chain. They're not the bottom of the social structure. So there is definitely a racial component to this. Absolutely. Planters argued several reasons for the continuation of slavery, and these are the arguments that most slave owners made. One, it's in the Bible. God says it's okay. Second, wage slaves in factories in the North have it worse off. Slaves are happy being slaves. That is George Fitzhugh, Southern sociologist, who made that argument. The term wage slave for the factory worker in the North. And they make the argument, think about the factory worker in the North. Are they provided free housing? No. Free clothing? No. Free food? No. Free medical care? No. Slave is. Slave gets all that. The slave owner takes care of their slaves. The factory owner just thinks of the workers as replaceable. That's the argument. The Southerner would say, well, we treat our people better. They're happy being slaves. The scientific argument. Blacks are a distinct species. They're not even the same as whites. So you can't give them equal status. It's science. Blacks couldn't handle freedom and needed to be looked after. That is the argument that's known as paternalism. Pater, father. They need a parent figure to guide them because they can't handle freedom on their own. If they could handle freedom on their own, how are they so easy to take from Africa? If they could have resisted, why didn't they? That's the argument. And then finally, John C. Calhoun's argument, the greater good. The greater good. No Hot Fuzz fans out there? The greater good. Thank you. Hot Fuzz. The greater good argument that by having slavery, it affords whites the freedom to govern, to think about democracy, to think about all of that kind of stuff. The greater good. All right, what else do we need to know? Planters often had sexual relations with their female slaves because they could, justifying it with the argument that they were property, not people. And since it's my property, I can do with my property what I want. Well, what about the mistress of the house? What's she going to say about this? What about the slave owner's wife while he's out there making time with the slaves? What is she going to do? What's she going to do? Huh? She's going to look the other way. That's exactly it. Why? Why is she going to look the other way? She don't pay no never minds to this. Yeah. What do you mean she has no real power?
Well, like, she would be like, oh, I want a divorce. It's not like she would get, like, 50% of the stuff. Would it still just all go to him?
Yeah, pretty much.
I'd have to say that's a pretty good reason to just kind of be like,
This is a very paternalistic society. It is a male-dominated society, even more so than the North. The female is even more subservient to the man in the South than in the North. Therefore, the woman would say, well, that's my husband's sphere of influence. The fields, the slaves, that's my husband's business. He's able to do with that what he needs to do. The wife takes care of the house. She's got an entire army of house slaves to take care of. She's got a food budget to take care of, a house budget. She's got to make sure the kids are educated and all that. She's got her own responsibilities in the house. That's her realm. His realm is out in the field, out doing the business, out in politics. That's my husband's realm. So there was definitely that separation of spheres between the planter and his wife. And then if they had children, if the slave master and the slave had children, the child was a slave. Because slavery by slave code was determined matrilineally through the mother. Slave codes are in every state. Now, state slave codes are different from state to state to state, but every state has them. They are the laws and the rules that govern what slaves can and mostly can't do. Slaves would often be rented out during the harvest. A lot of the small-time slave owners, the guys who own 2 to 5 slaves, they would rent their slaves out in order to make a little extra money. Cotton planters employed the gang system of labor, take the gang out into the fields. They're overseen by an overseer. We've talked about that. That's the cotton plantation. The rice and sugar plantations, where the land was a little more fetid, a little more stagnant, swampy, mosquito-y, disease-ridden. That's where slaves were given a list of tasks to get done. That's the task system. Older slaves, female slaves, become house slaves, cooks, caregivers, and craftsmen. Turn the page. Southern society was divided up into very rigid layers. At the top is the planter elite. Then you've got the small-time slave owner who owned between 2 to 5 slaves. Then you've got your urban professionals, doctors, lawyers, etc., who generally own no slaves. Then you've got your yeoman farmer. He owns land, but doesn't own slaves. He's just a subsistence farmer trying to get by. That's the bulk of Southern society, right there. The yeoman farmer is the bulk of Southern society. Owns no slaves, but owns enough land just to make ends meet. Then you've got your underclass whites. These are the people who don't even own land. They don't own slaves, they don't own land. They're like day laborers. They're hired out. Then you've got a separate group of whites living in the South called mountain whites. These are the folks who live in the Appalachian Mountains. These are the descendants of the Scots-Irish settlers. The folks who were distrustful of authority. They didn't like the king. They didn't like the new federal government. And guess what? They don't like the planter elites. They don't like them. They don't trust them. They don't trust authority in general. They don't own slaves. They barely make enough money to get by. And so they don't like the fact that the South is dominated by this planter elite class. Then you've got free blacks. And on the eve of the Civil War, there were about 250,000 free blacks living in the South. Okay, so a map showing you where the free blacks in America were living, mainly along the coastal areas. And just to show you, the largest population of free blacks living in the South lived in Maryland. with Virginia close behind. What must life have been like for a free black living in the South, especially as you get more close to the Civil War? Yeah.
I don't know how to put this back. That's sort of like an on paper, you're free sort of thing. I don't know when this was enacted, but at some point, you could just see a black person in the street and be like, oh, you must be someone's slave, so I can turn you in for a reward. You can just get back into the system, even if you're genuinely free or anything.
Even if you were freed, your freedom wasn't guaranteed. You could be swept up in a slave patrol. You could be swept up and carried into slavery, even if you were free, even if you had paperwork. Because you were slave codes required that you, if you were a free black, you had to have paperwork demonstrating your freedom. And if you could not prove your freedom, whoop! Anybody see 12 Years a Slave? Good. Guys, go watch 12 Years a Slave. Okay? It's the true story of Solomon Northup. I read it when I was a freshman in college. Here's a guy from New York, free black, born free. Born free. And he's swept up by a slave posse and carried to Louisiana and made a slave for 12 years until he's able to escape through the Underground Railroad and make it to freedom. No, I'm sorry, I gave away the ending. And he goes back north and he writes a book, and it's a bestseller. And it comes out in 1852, 53. But you want to know why you never hear of Solomon Northup's 12 Years a Slave? Do you know what came out the same year his book did? Uncle Tom's Cabin. And that's the book that overshadowed 12 Years a Slave. Everybody read Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was the #1 bestseller in America and in Europe. And it was a total falsehood. Never happened. 12 Years a Slave really happened. Nobody bought it. And then you had slaves at the bottom. Slaves resisted their enslavement by sabotaging equipment, purposefully slowing down work, stealing food, etc. Slaves would often run off and try to escape, especially when abolitionism starts to take off in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and you start to get the formation of the Underground Railroad, which is really not a railroad, people. There's at least one or two of you sitting out there thinking about a train right now. It's not a railroad. Go, Freedom Train, go. It's a system of safe houses where you could hide on your way out of the South and into the North. And after 1850, after the Compromise of 1850, when they enact a new fugitive slave law that allowed Southerners to go into northern states and arrest escaped slaves, most slaves are going to try not even just to get to the North, they're going to try to get to Canada. That was safety. Canada was safety. Canada was freedom. And they use the codes in the songs and the spirituals. The directions are embedded in the songs that they sing. How to get out. Slave rebellions were uncommon but noteworthy as they led to increased Southern paranoia about abolitionists. There are 3 main slave rebellions, aside from the Stono Rebellion that took place in 1739 during the colonial period. That's always one that they ask about. But there are 3 other slave rebellions you need to know. 1, Prosser's Rebellion in 1800. Gabriel Prosser organizes a conspiracy. They're going to kidnap Governor James Monroe of Virginia. It's found out. Prosser is executed. 1822, Denmark Vesey. He's organizing a slave rebellion in Charleston, South Carolina, with the help of the free black community, and in particular, the free black churches in Charleston. Vesey is found out and executed, and South Carolina places major restrictions on free blacks, what they can and can't do. 1831, the Nat Turner Rebellion. This is probably the most famous slave rebellion. The Nat Turner Rebellion was inspired by William Lloyd Garrison, newspaper guy who wrote a newspaper called The Liberator, called for the immediate emancipation of slaves. No conditions. Nat Turner leads a rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia, that winds up killing over 50 whites. Some in their beds at night while they slept. They were stabbed to death. Yeah, that'll freak Southerners out. Slaves coming in the middle of the night, slitting your throat. Yeah. That's going to cause a lot of paranoia. Not just about slaves, not just about free blacks, but about abolitionists as well. And anytime somebody new came to town, who are you? Why are you here? There's a great deal of paranoia among Southerners about undermining the slave system. Is the free black community working in cahoots with abolitionists? Are the abolitionists working in cahoots with Congress people trying to limit or ban slavery? Yeah.
The Liberator was like a northern newspaper, and a lot
Yes.
of Quakers in the South would read it.
Yep.
And a lot of posts in the South used to even touch it. They'd be like, no, I'm not delivering that to you.
Well, the newspaper was banned.
Yeah.
A lot of abolitionist rhetoric and a lot of abolitionist papers were banned in the South. And it's funny you make mention of Quakers. The Grimke sisters, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, they grew up on a southern cotton plantation in South Carolina. They were the daughters of a cotton planter, and they witnessed the horrors of slavery, so much so that they moved north and went on speaking tours to speak out against slavery. They became very famous on the anti-slavery lecture circuit as being people who had lived there and seen it. And then you've got the Underground Railroad taking off, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass from the 1830s until the Civil War. Planters saw this as evidence of a northern conspiracy to undermine the South's way of life. Southern punishment could be brutal to enforce obedience to planters. Sometimes punishments were meted out simply for amusement, because you could. Slaves were bred to make new slaves. Since the slave trade had been banned, the international slave trade, you couldn't import slaves to the United States after 1808. So if you wanted more slaves, you had to make more slaves. Free blacks and the AME Church helped blacks cope with living in America through mutual aid societies, black newspapers, speaking out against slavery at Lyceum events. Lyceum events are like concerts without the music or the fun. Lyceums were outdoor events where you would get a slate of public speakers, and you would go and you would listen to this group of public speakers talk. And abolitionist speakers in the North were quite popular. But the free black community provided a great deal of aid and assistance to blacks, especially blacks who were trying to escape slavery along the Underground Railroad. But even if you were a free black living in the North or a free black living in a southern city, you could go to these black communities for help and assistance, especially with the church. African American culture was unified by the experience of slavery and dominated by African tradition married with Christian teaching, especially after the beginning of the Second Great Awakening. African Americans were able to maintain strong kinship networks to keep family together despite being sold at auction and separated over long distances. That's why aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents are so important in African American culture. It goes back to the time when families were split up. Southern politicians tried to stop the movement in government to abolish slavery by passing gag resolutions, forbidding anti-slavery measures from even being brought to the floor of the Congress. So you weren't in Congress, Southern politicians were blocking the ability to even talk about limiting slavery. These gag resolutions, you're not even allowed to talk about it. You're not even allowed to bring it up. As abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and David Walker became more organized and vociferous, Southern planters feared they may be becoming isolated in their own nation, and sectionalism increased. And these are three big abolitionists that you should know. William Lloyd Garrison, the editor of The Liberator, he is a white editor of The Liberator, but he believes in getting rid of slavery because he thinks it's the right thing to do. He called for the immediate emancipation of slavery without delay and without compensation. See, there were several different proposals. One, you could let slavery go as it is. Two, you could buy up all the slaves, load them on a boat, and ship them back to Africa. That was what was called the colonization movement. That started in the 18 teens. Let's buy up all the slaves and ship them back to Africa. Then there was the compensated emancipation idea. Let's pay slave owners for their slaves and then set them free. But we'll pay them money. You know who was a big proponent of compensated emancipation? Abraham Lincoln. Even in the 1861-62, Abraham Lincoln was proposing compensated emancipation. You know how much it would have cost the federal government in 1862 to buy up every slave in America and set them free? $2 billion in 1862 money. $2 billion. There wasn't enough money around to do that. But think about it. The total net worth of slavery in America at the Civil War was about $2 billion in investment tied up. That's a lot of money. And with the stroke of a pen, gone. The Emancipation Proclamation is probably one of the bravest things any American politician has ever done. David Walker. David Walker was an escaped slave living in Massachusetts. He was a tailor. And he was publishing his own stuff. His most famous thing was Walker's Appeal. And in Walker's Appeal, David Walker says that blacks should meet violence with violence. That's kind of dangerous. And he was getting his information into the South by sewing his work inside the inseams of clothing that he was making. So he would put the stuff inside the inseams and then cover it up and stitch it. And it would get into the South. It should come as no surprise David Walker was found dead on his front porch under mysterious circumstances. And then finally, Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave from the eastern shore of Maryland, makes his way north. He writes his famous autobiography of how he escaped slavery. He goes on to publish a newspaper called the North Star. Gesundheit. And the North Star is a popular abolitionist newspaper being published out of New York. Douglass argued for a political solution to slavery. He said that if you wanted to get rid of slavery, you had to amend the Constitution in order to do so. All right. So differences of opinion on how to go about dealing with slavery, which I'll talk more about in the next chapter. Now, with the stuff that I put on this list, was there anything from the reading that you had written in the homework that wasn't covered here? Not that you have an opportunity to look at it since I collected it from you, but do you remember anything from the homework that may not be here? By the way, if you're trying to figure out what a good entry on the homework looks like, those are great examples of good entries. Yeah. A kinship network. Maintaining ties between your family and your extended family. That's a kinship network. Well, yeah, what are you talking about? Southern whites or Southern blacks? Southern whites had kinship networks too, but for blacks, the kinship network was essential. It was a lifeline in order to keep family together. Even though family may be divided up. I mean, if you got a husband, a wife, and their kids, all of them could be sold at auction to different slave owners. Especially if you were a slave living in the Chesapeake region and being sold to the Deep South. Tobacco planting, not as profitable as cotton planting. So a lot of northern Upper South planters were selling off their slaves to cotton planters in the Deep South. So a lot of families in the Chesapeake especially were divided up. So it was essential to maintain strong kinship networks and know who your family was. So that's why there was an emphasis on cousins and aunts and uncles and grandparents, etc. Anything else regarding slavery? Okay. Let's move on to the next chapter, chapter 12. Guys, I know this is fast. I know that it's a lot of shortcuts and stuff. Unfortunately, we are so far behind, it's not even funny. Do you know I'm supposed to be at 1900 by the midterm? 1900 by the midterm. They expect me to be at 1900 by the midterm. It's impossible. Anyway, chapter 12. This is the chapter on reformers. So the big question I've asked, okay, the big guiding question for this chapter is, did reformers of the antebellum seek to improve society or control society? One seems benevolent, improvement. The other seems a little bit more dominating, control, limiting, placing barriers on society. So were reformers about freedom, or were they about control? So as we go through and we look at the different movements, the different cultural movements of the antebellum period, that's really what you want to ask yourself. Are these guys about freedom, or are they about control? The purpose of antebellum reforms: romantic impulses that freedom could lead to a perfect society. There were those who believed that human beings were capable of creating a perfect society if they just worked hard enough. This is what is known as perfectionism. human beings were capable of creating a perfect society? Or did reformers feel the need to establish social control over a rapidly changing society? And if you think about the antebellum period and how rapid that change was, by 1831, you've got railroads. By 1837, you've got telegraphs and electricity, well, the beginnings of electricity. You've got steamboats. You've got mass production. You've got factories. You've got consumer goods. You've got the beginnings of department stores. You've got a society that has rapidly changed in a very short amount of time. Sometimes people can't handle that amount of change, and they freak out. Think about the social change. Irish and German immigrants coming en masse to the United States. That's a great deal of social change. Think about the political change. The common man able to vote in droves changes the way politics are done in America. Western expansion, the size of the country is changing. You've got so many changes happening in such a short amount of time. It's no wonder that people are wanting to say, whoa, wait a minute. Slow down. Now, we've talked about, chapter 12 covers the Hudson River School. I've already covered the Hudson River School and art and all of that. I don't need to cover that anymore. Literature, I talked about the Knickerbocker School, American stories set against American backdrops. I've already talked about that. American cultural identity, okay? But one area of writers that tended to gain popularity in the 1830s in particular were a group called Transcendentalists. Now, this is the core philosophy of Transcendentalism. This is Transcendentalism defined. This is what it is. The belief that the individual can achieve reason through reliance, self-reliance, and instincts. If I had a motto for Transcendentalists, it would be trust thyself. Trust your instincts. Trust your abilities. And if you do that and work hard, you can achieve reason. That every individual has the capability of exploring their inner capacity in order to understand nature. And not just nature, but the individual's place in nature. Each person has an inner light. I see inner light, I think Quakers. And the ability to transcend societal earthly constraints. What in the what? That's starting to sound a little hippy-dippy to me. Transcend earthly confines to understand the nature of the universe? And discover man's connection to the universe? What Transcendentalists referred to as the oversoul. Yes. Transcendental meditation, yes, becomes popular at this time. The ability to get in contact with yourself and think about your connection to the wide universe around you. Now, I know this may all seem kind of weird, and these guys even formed a community devoted to this endeavor, where they were all going to sit around and think. You're laughing. Why? Why are you laughing? Timmy, why are you laughing? Why? What do you picture in your head?
bunch of guys sitting around a table with their eyes closed.
Yeah. Is any work getting done? No. Guys, I know this may seem weird, I know it may seem strange, but you have all encountered transcendentalism. You have all encountered this concept of the oversoul. You want to know where you've encountered it? And I remember this line from Empire Strikes Back, where Yoda says to Luke Skywalker, "You must become one with the ship, with the tree, with the rock. We're all connected. We're all luminous beings." That's transcendentalism. That's the concept of the oversoul, that we are all connected to the universe through an overpowering force. The force is the oversoul. Guys, these are the 1840s equivalent of hippies. These are the 1840s equivalent of hippies. And if they had drugs back then, they probably would have been doing them. What's that? Thank you. Yes. No, it wasn't a large movement, but it was an influential movement. There was this emphasis on self-improvement and education. And that is something that pervaded American society, because this is also the time where you start to see the formation of the public school system. So there is something that comes out of it. But this idea of self-improvement and self-reliance, does this sound like improved society or controlled society? It sounds like improvement. It just sounds like freedom. Improvement. Now, there are two very famous transcendental writers that they always ask about on the test. Now, for God's sakes, don't write all this down. Just know the titles. Nature, Self-Reliance, and the American Scholar. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Anybody read Emerson? Nobody? We didn't do this with you in 10th grade? He didn't do Self-Reliance with you guys? An excerpt. Well, that's good. All right. So I've given you 3 quotes that I think best reflect Emerson's approach to transcendentalism. 1, it is in the woods that we return to reason and faith and are uplifted into infinite space. I am part and particle of God. I am part and particle of God. We are all star stuff. We're all made up of the same materials, man. Dude. Now, this is something that a lot of teenagers latch on to. A lot of college students latch on to Emerson and think themselves deep. Self-reliance. There is a time in every man's education when he arrives at the conviction that envy is ignorance, that imitation is suicide, that he must take himself for better for worse as his portion, that though the wide universe is full of good, no kernel of nourishing corn can come to him, but through his toil bestowed on that plot of ground which is given him to till. What do you mean? Yeah, he's like, don't be a conformist, man. Be yourself. Be an individual. But what else is he saying here? No, through his toil bestowed on that plot of ground which is given him to toil. Yeah. You have to take what you're given. God has made you you. Be the best you can be. Don't try to be somebody else. Don't waste your life trying to be something you're not. Embrace who you are and work at it. That's what he's saying. And rely on yourself. Trust thyself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string. Accept the place the divine providence, God, has found for you in the society of your contemporaries and the connection of events. Great men have always done so. He's saying great men know who they are and are confident in themselves. And I love this quote. And we are now men, and must accept in the highest mind the same transcendent destiny, and not minors and invalids in a protected corner, not cowards fleeing before a revolution, but guides, redeemers, and benefactors, obeying the almighty effort and advancing on chaos and the dark. I got chills reading that. Why? What is he saying here? We are now men, and must accept in the highest mind our destiny. We're not invalids, we're not minors, but we are guides, redeemers, and benefactors advancing on chaos and the dark. I want to give you a moment to mull that over in your head, because it's actually part of my core philosophy. Yeah. Well, I would argue Emerson believes that people are capable of change, that they're capable of self-improvement, absolutely, but to what end? Well, he's definitely talking about self-confidence, that you gotta know who you are before you can improve the world. You have to know who you are before you can go out and improve the world, but that is your charge. Your charge is to be the best you can be in order to change the world. You're not an invalid. You're not helpless. Stop hiding. That's what he's saying. Stop hiding. Come out and be who you are and embrace it and love it and develop it. Not just for you, but for the benefit of all mankind. That's great stuff. Here's another one of my favorite quotes. In the right mind, he, human beings, is man thinking. In the degenerate state, when the victim of society, he tends to become a mere thinker, or still worse, the parrot of other men's thinking. What's it mean? You're just copying stuff. The real American scholar is the one who comes up with his own thoughts, based on his own experience. Not sitting there parroting what other people say, but coming up with it on his own. His/her. Emphasis on the individual and freedom and the ability to improve oneself. That's transcendentalism right there. And so that you can get in contact with the greater universe. Now, the other major writer in the transcendentalist world is Henry David Thoreau. Did anybody come across Thoreau in their English travels? Nobody read Walden? What do you people do over there? Here's a guy, back here, Emerson says, "It is in the woods that we return to faith and reason." Thoreau takes him up on that offer and moves into the woods. Literally moves into the woods. Gets a cat. He's like the Unabomber without the bombs. But he lives in a cabin in the woods. And sometimes he'll go running naked through the woods to get in contact with nature. Watch out for those briars. Watch out for those sticker bushes. But Thoreau lived in a cabin by Walden Pond, just outside of Boston, outside of, I just like saying the name Swampscott. And Thoreau not only wrote a number of nature-centered ideas, but he also said that he takes the idea of Emerson further, that if we are man-thinking, and if we are the self-actualized individual, we have a duty to make society better and confront wrongdoing where we see it. How do we do this? Civil disobedience. No, I'd argue Jesus is the first one to think of it. Want to go back? Oh, God. Nah. I'm sorry, forgot. Sundays normally I sit and I pick a couple of Bible verses to read with my son and daughter. So I got to think about what I want to do with them. Anyway, no, I like to supplement what we learn in church with additional stuff. So anyway, I'm trying to make them good people. Anyway, civil disobedience. Yeah, I would argue Jesus is really the template for this, but Thoreau is kind of following in those footsteps. And this is written in 1846 in reaction to the Mexican War. Now, we'll talk about the Mexican War a little later, hopefully not too much later. He says, how does it become a man to behave toward this American government today? I answer that he cannot, without disgrace, be associated with it. He is ashamed of the American government. I cannot, for an instant, recognize that political organization as my government, which is the slave's government also. Thoreau believes that the Mexican War is a conspiracy of Southern politicians to expand American territory for the purpose of expanding slavery. James K. Polk, president during the Mexican War, is a Tennessee planter working with other Southern politicians. They are the ones that called for a war with Mexico. As a matter of fact, there's even belief that Polk manufactured the war with Mexico. By saying like Mexico had weapons of mass destruction. Not that. They had weapons of mass destruction. We got to go get them, smoke them in and out of their homes. Unjust laws exist. Shall we be content to obey them? Or shall we endeavor to amend them and obey them until we have succeeded? Or shall we transgress them at once? Under a government which imprisons any unjustly, the true place for a just man is also a prison. He is saying, look, man, if there are unjust laws out there, we have a duty as self-actualized individuals to call attention to that in any way necessary and break the law if we must. Not with violence, but break the law in order to draw attention to the injustice being exacted. Who does this sound like? Gandhi, Jesus. Who else? Think American. Martin Luther King. Absolutely. And guys, when Martin Luther King was interviewed and he was asked who his major influences were, Jesus, Gandhi, Thoreau. Now, some people believe that you could take the idea of a perfect society and create it. Utopianism, creating a perfect society. Now look, there are a number of different utopian experiments in America. You've got business and industry cooperatives. How can we improve upon the factory system so that we don't have wage slaves? Intellectual utopians, like the Brook Farm experiment. I call it an experiment. It collapsed. It failed. The Brook Farm, that was the transcendentalists. They're all worried about sitting around and philosophizing and not worrying about planting food. Hey, there's work to be done. Dude, man, I'm too busy thinking. That's why hippie communes don't work. Everybody thinks that they're this intellectual giant. And then religious communities like Oneida and Mormons and Shakers attempts by different religious sects to create their own little version of paradise here on earth. So we're going to take a look at all three of these different utopian communities real quick. For instance, a good example of an attempt at a utopian business community is something called New Harmony. Robert Owen was a Scot immigrant who had created a model factory back in Scotland. He wanted to replicate that here in America and founded a settlement in New Harmony, Indiana, on the Wabash River, just north of the Ohio River. Down around Tippecanoe. This was the vision. It was never built. But that's what he had in mind. And the idea was, listen to this, you have a factory where all the families live. They all share in the profits. They share in the ownership. They're provided with shelter, food. The kids are provided with a free public education. They're provided with free health care. This is 170 years before Obamacare. They're provided with free health care, and when they get of age, they can retire with an old age pension. What's that sound like? You retire, you get a check. Social Security. These guys are coming up with Social Security 90 years before it was actualized. But this is Robert Owen's vision at New Harmony, is to create a business model that takes care of its employees rather than exploits them. The reason why he couldn't get this off the ground is he couldn't get the funding. They built a couple of buildings at New Harmony, but nothing like what you've got here. You can see here where all the utopian communities in the country are located. Why in the north? They're all in the north. Why in the north? So, okay, so this is in their face. You're right. All the problems of society are in the face of Americans in the North. All the change that has taken place mainly in the North. New immigrants, they're moving into the North. New technologies, you're seeing them in the North. Railroads, built in the North. Canals, built in the North. Factories, built in the North. All this rapid change is taking place in the North. So a lot of these attempts at fixes to those problems are also seen in the North. As a matter of fact, if you notice here, this is where a lot of your factories are in New England. It's where a lot of your utopian communities are. And along the Erie Canal, you've got a lot of utopian communities. Some were religious, some were business, the Fourierist phalanxes. This was the belief that each community should have a set number of people in it. Each person had a role in that community, and that was a perfect community.
Your morning announcement will be on shortly.
And some were religious. All right. We really at that point already? Okay. All right. I'll have to cover the rest of it next time. You guys have got hold on a second. You guys have got a chart in front of you. That's what I would like you to do for homework. That. Okay? And if you take a look at the chart, it asks for, with each movement, the key individuals, key goals, and were they successful? Did they achieve what they set out to achieve? Okay? That's all you need to do. Yeah. It does.
Today is Monday, December 16th at B-Day. Please stand for your pledge of allegiance. I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Attention class of 925. Please see Mr. Hall